Hi everyone, it's awesome to see you all here to witness the very first session of Dialogues, our panel discussion module. And I assure you, we can't be more thrilled to have the Design Futures initiatives with us today to discuss decolonizing the future, building communities, and implementing more futures approaches within design thinking and organizations. Please welcome the members of the panel. Pupul Bisht, the creative lead and network weaver for NGFP at the School of International Futures and founder of the Decolonizing Futures Initiative, a global project that aims to engage marginalized communities in imagining their preferred futures to inform and inspire inclusive policymaking and innovation. She's a futurist and designer with a deep passion for exploring cultural plurality in contemporary design practices. With storytelling, she hopes to move foresight outside organizational confines and engage in mass dialogue about our collective future as a civilization. Next up, we have Dana Doc Martins, a board member at the Design Futures Initiative, director and UX designer at Teach for America, also the panel moderator for today. Dana Martins is a designer, creative technologist, maker, teacher, lifelong student and geek working to educate and empower communities to embrace the potential of speculative practice, to understand how emerging technologies might be leveraged for social impact. Please welcome Jorge Camacho, co-founder of Diagonal E Studio, a research, design, and future studio based in Mexico City. He's a strategist designer, foresight strategist, researcher, and lecturer. He works as a research affiliate at Institute for the Future and with organizations to design products, services, and strategies based on deep and original human insights, as well as emerging issues and trends. We also have Mansi Parekh, an award-winning business designer, innovation and future foresight strategist at Future Tense Inc., also its founder. Future Tense is a strategic foresight and innovation consultancy and a next-gen foresight practitioner fellow. She runs experiments in the liminal spaces between the past, present, and futures, both real and imagined, with projects like the design fiction zine, Variations on Tomorrow. Thanks a lot for being here. The stage is all yours.
Hey, everybody. Good afternoon for you. It's morning here for me in the East Coast.
Sorry, Doc. I still can't hear you. So I'm just checking. Are you able to hear me? Really sorry about this.
Can you guys hear me?
I can.
It's back.
Pupul as well.
I don't know. It keeps coming and going. Sorry.
It's okay. That's something we'll get to today. The accelerating pace of technology leaves all of us in confusion. I feel you on that.
No, I think I lost you again. I'm going to try and disconnect and connect back.
Okay, come on, go ahead and come on back. We see you. So really quickly, while Pupul's doing that, I'm super happy to be here today to represent the Design Futures Initiative. As I mentioned earlier, I am our Director of Communication and Special Programs. So what that means is that I help to manage all of the digital platforms to help our members connect with one another online and also work on new and different initiatives. And so just like a little background information about the Design Futures Initiative, we are a nonprofit founded in 2015 whose mission is to bring together designers and strategists and artists and scientists and futurists, and you get the idea, all of these diverse different professions and different practices together to really think about the implications for the future, right? To sort of facilitate and advance these responsible design and strategy practices that more carefully consider ethical and cultural, environmental, political, and economic challenges, and what some of the opportunities are to come together for maybe future products, services, and systems that work for more people, or this idea of futures for all, right? That everyone has a vision of the future that's equally as worthy and equally as important to put forward into the future together. And so our focus areas as a nonprofit are communities. We have over 50 speculative futures meetups around the world. We have actually one in India, and you're welcome to start one. Anyone can start one in a new city. There's this very decentralized model of people all over the world who are interested in this work and want to come together and talk about it. And we just sort of provide a loose framework to bring them together and to even more cool stuff. We also do some advocacy and different types of sort of programming where we are trying to maybe engage the practice of futures thinking and futures design, and how that can fit in with other practices like design thinking. And then finally, we're about education. We're about sort of spreading futures thinking to all different fields and making it accessible at different levels for different types of people. And so two things we have coming up in that regards is that we have our annual conference primer coming up in July. We actually have our call for speakers and workshops open right now. The theme is Now What? Basically after this whole last year, I could go into detail and you can read the call, but after this whole last year, now what we're going to do about the future, and really how has it changed the ideas about what kind of futures we want and what are possible. And then secondly, we have our new Futures by Design class coming up in July, which is a 2-day workshop where we work through a framework that we've been developing called the Futures by Design framework, which is a sort of like a loose way of thinking about how you could do speculative projects from start to finish, or some of the mindsets and modes of thinking that are helpful. So that is my spiel for DFI. If you want to learn more about us, you can check out our website, futures.design. You're also welcome to email us at hello@futures.design, and we're happy to answer any questions you might have or give you more information. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to be moderating today, and that's a loose word. Really, the four of us are going to be having a conversation together about a couple of topics, and I'll just be helping to facilitate and to move us along. There's no hierarchy here of like moderating and speaking. So I'm going to get us started so that we can move through everything and make sure we have lots of time at the end to answer any questions from y'all, because I'm sure that your questions are probably even more interesting than like our questions and talking points. So I want to start out by talking a little bit about the name in the panel, right? This idea of decolonizing the future. This is a really big topic, and it can mean different things to different people. But maybe a lot of these, I think we've been thinking about a lot of these terms, do come out of different practices and fields in terms of what decolonization means. So I want to start out by just saying, when you hear this idea of decolonizing the future, what does that mean for you, and what does that not mean for you? And whoever wants to start first.
Maybe I can start then.
Yeah.
No, I think it's really interesting. Well, first of all, thanks to Ishanya for having us, and to my co-panelists. Something that we've been thinking about here in Mexico and with Diagonal, and that I think is one of the ways, at least, to get into talking about decolonizing design. I wouldn't say that is precisely what should be, or exclusively what should be, explored in this big concept. So one small part is the idea of getting more people involved in thinking and imagining futures than otherwise has been. So some of the projects that we have been developing in Diagonal Studio in Mexico have been about getting people from different socioeconomic backgrounds involved in projects, in processes aimed at generating images of the future than otherwise have been involved. So for example, we developed a project a couple of years ago where we invited 3 families from around Mexico City to imagine futures in order to develop an installation that we showed at the Design Festival to sort of like kickstart a conversation about how different images of the future can be developed when you involve different kinds of people. So for that project, we and actually coinciding with, if I remember correctly, was the theme of like speculative futures around that year, which was Futures for All. We sort of like took that and thought through the project about how, for us at least, the idea of Futures for All meant two things. So one was futures involving, as I said, different people, but also the idea that the images of the future that results from these perhaps more diverse participatory processes should also lead to images of the future that potentially include everyone, so that the people that are involved in these features can find themselves in those images of the future. And not only that, but perhaps also finding themselves in ways that, like living flourishing lives and these important things. So that would be my sort of like my first approach to something as big as the idea of decolonizing futures.
Yeah. I would like to add to that, Doc, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Just picking up exactly from there, Futures for All, which I believe was the theme for Prime 2019, and very rightly so. I always say Futures for All cannot be imagined by a few. And for me, that's where, my sort of journey or entry into decolonizing futures as a practice really begins. But in my own work, I have the way I not define, but the way I understand decolonizing futures is it is a very intentional decentering of Anglo-Eurocentric philosophies, tradition, ways of knowing, being, and doing that have been dominant in design discourse and futures discourse, and really in the modern capitalistic society that we live in. So it is about decentering that so that you can create room for non-Anglocentric ways of knowing, being, and doing. So, being a designer, I definitely have a small bias towards creation and methods. So for me, it is also about decolonizing our toolkits. As designers, sometimes I think we don't do a sufficient job of questioning our own methods, our own frameworks. And what we don't realize is that frameworks and methods emerge from certain time periods, they emerge from certain societies, so they tend to carry the biases and assumptions of those societies. And so when they're uncritically applied to newer contexts, what you're really doing is you're perpetuating the same power dynamics, right? So decolonizing design, decolonizing futures is about questioning where power is held in the entire design process? And are we doing a sincere enough job to question that power and to dismantle it and to reorganize it, And I always say that decolonization is not an abstract concept or musing. It is actually a really powerful call to action um, that is in response to real lived history of colonization. And colonization was about extraction, it was about domination. And what colonization did is it really disrupted or dismantled structures of local self-organization and local self-organization, right? And actualization, sorry, in communities that have been historically marginalized. So a lot of the decolonization work is about, can we, through our design processes and design work and futures thinking, actually facilitate the process of regenerations of those systems of self-actualization, right? So that communities become the active shapers of their futures rather than passive recipients of someone else's vision, often shipped, from offshore. And this is really very true in the context of South Asia, which I believe where most of our audience is from today.
Yeah, I'll just sort of add to that really quick. And I think in the danger, right, of when that doesn't happen right, is that if you fail to sort of recognize that there's a colonial structure inherent in capitalism and capital, and now digital capital, right? And it embodies and sort of reflects these structural inequities that we've had throughout history. And it doesn't just do that, it actually exacerbates them because a lot of what we see in the futures and design spaces is looking at emerging technologies, right? And we sort of imagine these emerging and digital technologies to be somehow emancipatory or liberating. Like that's something we were hoping for, right? Is this dream that technology was going to free us, but at the same time, they're actually truly, steeped in these colonialist practices that have come out throughout history. And so I really liked what you said about criticality, right? And then just this understanding that we have to start with a critical understanding of power, and the power to envision the future is a type of power, and like who holds this and who doesn't, and who's seen and who's not seen, who's who's invisible and exploited. So I 100%, I feel you on that sort of like that point. I really like that. Mansi, did you want to add something to that?
No, I think you guys covered most of it. But one piece that really sort of comes back to me over and over again, especially when we see these more Anglo-Western centric features, visions, whether they're in film or story form or whatever form they take. There's almost this move, and we see this also in the way we conduct business now. Is that there's almost this move towards homogenizing. Like if everybody doesn't act and think like the same way, it's somehow wrong. And when you see a lot of the communities that were traditionally colonized, they celebrate plurality. They celebrate a plurality of thought, of culture, of ways of being. And I think that that's something that we need to sort of slowly bring back, get people more comfortable with that idea of plurality, and saying that, okay, we can create things that aren't necessarily going to apply like for like to 9 billion people on the planet. We want to create things that are useful within communities, and at different levels create those things can look differently. They don't have to be the same way. And I think that that's a very big part of decolonizing future and decolonizing thought to a very large extent, is to say that can we imagine that more than one kind of person or one stereotypical persona is going to use the things that we're creating, and if that, how can we accommodate for that? How can we help the people who are going to use these things to also imagine themselves, as Jorge mentioned, flourishing in that future? Can we bring that? Can we make people believe that? Because a lot of generations actually don't believe that anymore, just because they're bombarded with very homogenous looking ideals of what the future could look like. And I think that bringing that plurality in could be vital to revitalizing these older cultures, these ways of being, and making people more comfortable in their own skin as well.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. Something that I think people like quote a lot in future spaces, but maybe don't dig into enough, is it's really important to examine the past in order to think about the future, right? Because at the simplest level, as humans, we seem to not learn lessons throughout the cycles of history, and so we actually have a lot to learn from, the challenges that people are having even like 1,000 years ago, and sort of how they were solving them in their own way. So I think that's an important point to make. So sort of spinning off of that, does anybody have any last points they want to make on our first one before we sort of move on to thinking about, how do we, talking about this diversity of futures, how do we sort of bring that into the community?
I wanted to, add something, and it's not. I mean, I think it's mostly kind of like a question, like an open question, not necessarily something that you need to answer. More like something that I've been wondering a lot, and I'm coming back to that project that I referred to early, and hopefully I'm gonna try to tie this back to something that Pupul mentioned, and that it's kind of like, I think, the deepest part of the idea of the colonizing futures. A lot of a good part of the ideas that are surrounding these call for decolonizing futures and decolonizing design have to do with, I would say, like stepping away from Eurocentric ways of thinking and living and doing, what in a more academic sense we would call like ontologies, so ways of seeing the world, ways of living, etc. And something that I realized as I was developing that project and engaging with people that, as I said before, were not necessarily used to these processes, these tools, as Pupul mentioned, I realized that there is something very basic about futures practice that that we sometimes don't, or at least I can speak for myself, had not sort of like questioned myself before. And it's the fact that whenever we think about the future, when we use all the established methods and tools for engaging with futures imagination, we are sort of like taking for granted that things need to change. That in order to imagine the future, you need to imagine things changing. And I think that is already, and that's a very kind of like basic, like ontological thing that we impose when we bring these futures perspectives or with these futures processes. So so one of the insights I had, which I haven't been able to really resolve in any way, in any methodological or theoretical way, is that we need to be careful not to impose change especially when we bring people into these processes, because the idea that I had then was that change should always be there for people, but only as an option. I would feel very bad in sort of like engaging with people and forcing them the idea that they have to change in order to to move towards the future. So it's interesting, something that I would like to follow very closely as these important projects develop around the idea of decolonizing futures, would be how to develop tools, methods, and ways of thinking that doesn't impose these ontological categories into people, into our sort of like in our participatory processes and all that.
Right. Like, how do you not, how do you understanding the thinking, doing this work both opens up and closes down certain futures all times, and how do you, instead of taking them off the table, maybe put more of the options on the table and let people choose between them, right? I think that's a really good point, that even by doing the work, you're doing change, right? Because you're envisioning, and then people can see those visions. And so it can be a slippery slope of how that works.
Yeah.
So sort of spinning off what we were talking about before, I think a lot of us talked about how we need to bring more people to the table, that we need more diverse perspectives at all levels of futures. A lot of us work for organizations that may not be, using futures as part of their design process, right? So like in my day job as a UX designer, I can sneak a little future stuff in here and there, but right, it's not part of our normal process. Even though I would argue at the organizational level, right, in terms of strategy, it could be really meaningful. So how do you think we can sort of help other people's bring this idea of thinking about implications, thinking about futures, some of these tools and methods into either their organization or maybe their personal practice? And Mansi, why don't you start with this one?
So, this goes back to what Jorge was just talking about, is the things that, what are we aware of in our practice or the way we practice this, right? One of the things that any organization we engage with always believes is that there needs to be change, and that change is forward looking. So for example, that the future moves forward, and everything that gets left behind is in the past, and it's left behind as in it is entirely discarded. And I think if anybody has grown up in South Asian cultures, this idea that time moves forward is actually very contrary to the way
things are here. You constantly see the time almost looping around, rather than going straight line forward. We're going into the future, and I think that's one mindset. Like, I still struggle to shed it, but very often, I try to consciously remember, when I'm recommending to clients anything, or even working with a team and we're doing research, we're constantly looking at what came before and how those things are still going to carry forward, are still going to carry through. And we see this on an everyday basis. You go outside, you step outside your house, go to a market in India, and you'll see the fanciest shop right next to the most sort of unorganized market place situation. And we accept that in our day-to-day lives. We don't even question it. But at the same time, when we're making business decisions, we constantly believe that it's the new shiny thing that needs to win, that the older thing has no merit. So I think that that's something that I've begun bringing into conversations that I have with my clients. And I think that to some extent, it's also about questioning where any frameworks or any sort of thought, to actually question where it's coming from. What is the origin of it? What was it designed to do? And then seeing whether that premise still holds true, whether we need to tweak it to include a larger perspective or to include more voices in informing the decision that we make. And I think that has been working to some extent. People are still, at least in India, when you speak to people, they're still a little bit skeptical about planning for the future because, there's, our businesses are doing so well right now. Why do we need to think about the future? And that's a constant conversation still. But I've realized that there are some slightly easy, low touch ways in which you bring in that thought. It's whether it's in the conversation and say, things like, hey, but what's this thing going to look like in 10 years? It's just as simple as that, and just kind of get people thinking about it. Or saying something like, in said future, in 5 years or 10 years, if something like this happens, then what? Then how are we going to deal with it? So it's not entirely a formal engagement, but within an engagement, if you can begin to build in these conversations, I've realized that it's a low touch way of getting people to start thinking in that way. It might still take a while before we are able to integrate this wholly into our everyday practices, but I do think that when you do give a client something that is a little bit different, or you ask them a question that is a little bit uncomfortable for them, if you handle it well enough, it also sort of stimulates their thinking a little bit about what does it mean to do what they're doing right now.
Yeah, I love this idea of low touch futures. I think that's like a project waiting to happen. I just think of like the low hanging futures fruit, and it's like this like shiny futures fruit. It's like, here you go, like, but I think you made a really great point about giving people permission, right, to imagine, right, and asking them those prompts as a way to open their thinking. George, people, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. I loved everything that Mansi was talking about, and even the point that Jorge made before that. I think it comes down to really the biggest challenge that I see for practitioners of foresight, of design as well, that both of your comments spoke to, is how do the need really of the hour is to make these limitations of our methods, of our approach to design, that are actually extremely tacit, not just in the practice or the discourse itself, but really in the world that we live, make them explicit. And really, they have been accorded by way of enjoying historical dominance. These ideas, these value systems, these worldviews have been accorded a universal status. They are not universal. They're actually very, very subjective. It's just that that's where power was held. So they became the default. They became the neutral way of the way future will be, or who live in that future. I love that, Dana, what you said about who are we rendering invisible. Every time we paint a picture of a possibility in the future, anyone who does not find expression or visibility in that picture, then the picture is basically assuming that either that community doesn't exist 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, or even if they do, they continue to be marginalized in that reality as well. So I think that is a big issue that needs to be tackled head on for anyone who really wants to decolonize their practice, especially for designers. I would say that most of the people who are doing really inspiring work with decolonizing their practice, whether it's in education, whether it's in design, or even foresight, I think for one common thread for all of those people is that their starting point was their own personal lived experiences. And when you do that, you basically accept and respect the fact that because there was no common experience of colonization around the world, there is no common universal definition of decolonization. Exactly to Mansi's point, it is about plurality and being able to have the room to explore that in our work. So in my method, for example, that's precisely what I did. For me, it began with the shape of time. Why do all futures and design research methods begin with the premise of time being linear, right? Why is there an implicit idea of what is desirable growth, what is progress, and why do we need to be growing all the time? A lot of the communities I was working with, there was indigenous communities in Canada or certain communities, South Asia, they do not prescribe to that worldview, right? So what does it mean to think about the future from their worldview that is not growth obsessed, not progress obsessed? And how do we center and really celebrate more relational ways of living on this planet? And it's not just about rendering people or community invisible, it's also about rendering other species invisible through our work. And I'm assuming a lot of designers and design students are listening to us right now. And I think one sort of practical thought, I guess, that I can leave them with regards to this question is, I think as designers, we don't do a good enough job to think about long-term direct and indirect implications of what we put out in the world. We overestimate our power and influence as designers, but ironically, we underestimate the ways in which we disrupt the world and ways that communities live through the things that we actually design. So being extremely intentional and careful about, what happens to your design 10 years from now, 20 years from now. Designers need to start thinking in intergenerational time frames. And when you start doing that, you automatically build in care for the future, but also future generations into the work that you're doing.
No, thank you. I think you actually spun us like perfectly into our last question. So we already have some good questions from the audience. I want to make sure we finish answering this one so we can come to yours, which is, to your point, about building that community and building that advocacy. What are some ways that designers, maybe people in the audience, design students, emerging designers especially, how can they sort of get more education about, futures design, and especially about, futures practice from all the discussions we've been having from this diverse point of view, right? Maybe not this weird version, this, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic futures vision. And I just want to say one little thing that I was inspired by thinking about before was just that I also think that like a lot of the language about futures is in English, and which is actually an issue because, you look at other languages, a lot of them may not even conceive of the futures the same way, to your point about time, right? And to the words we use. I was just in a panel on language and innovation, and that it's even just something as simple as what language you're talking about the future, and can completely change your mindset around nature, around humans, around those boundaries, right? Around time and cycles. So sorry, I was very inspired by your point earlier. But to my original question, some parting words on how can you learn more and sort of build community and advocacy in this field. Maybe start with you, Jorge.
Sure, thanks. Well, speaking from my perspective, I think, one of the ways in which I personally have been able to grow community has been through teaching. I should also say that, when I say teaching, I always try, I try to sort of like not necessarily operate within a framework of, the expert teaching others. I obviously have been involved for years in teaching in different levels at the university. But I've always found that the context of teaching futures and incorporating futures practices in design, etc., has been the way in which I've been better able to grow community. So I've always not just through my classes and my workshops, a lot of colleagues have gone through and have then moved on elsewhere to spread, so to speak, to spread the word and then do workshops and courses themselves. But I think also the space of teaching, I always think of it as a kind of like a temporary bubble where a lot of interesting conversations can take place that otherwise is hard to have in an organizational context, for example. So for me, the experience of teaching has always been also about learning and about growing a community around practices. So that's what I've been mostly trying to do. Building communities around teaching.
Absolutely. Mansi, people, do you have any sort of ideas and suggestions for building that community of advocacy?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually want to go back to your point about language because it's very interesting. I have been curating a project called Recovered in Translation for the past 2-ish years, and it's finally going to be launched this month. So I was just going to sort of nudge anyone who's a language nerd. You can sort of keep an eye out. It's on Instagram, and basically it's going to be it's a project that is ultimately about community. And even though it started as a tiny exploration within my own limited, I don't actually speak many languages, but I started sort of inquiring concepts of futures in Hindi, for example, which is my mother tongue. And then now working with, certain futurists in Western Africa to look at, concepts of futures in their indigenous languages and also some people from Eastern Asia. So that is going to be a place of community building as well, around a really specific exploration of language and futures, and how do we sort of bring about more ideas around, what is desirable versus what is not, and time, of course. So that's one. The other thing I wanted to say is Ahmed Ansari, who is an incredible design scholar from Pakistan, currently lives and teaches in New York. He teaches at NYU. And every year, I think since last year, he's been doing these free summer courses that are just the most generous offering to the design community. And last summer, he did a pretty interesting and very thorough course on decolonizing design. And the entire course actually lives online. It's completely free. So anyone who's listening to us right now, you can go look it up and access all the reading lists and, the course structure, everything. And I believe he's running another course this summer. So I would say that is also a really interesting place to sort of go. If you're interested. And of course, DFI has a Slack channel, which I think is a really thriving community to be part of. And then lastly, the other sort of futures community that I can extend, an invitation to those listening right now is. One is Global Swarm that I'm part of, and we work particularly on participatory futures and participatory futures methods, how to plug them into business questions, policy problems, etc. And so every few months we run a bunch of gaming sessions, and that's just really a way for all of us to come together and in a really interesting and fun manner talk about ways in which we can sort of democratize this exercise of anticipating futures. And then the next thing, that another community that I am part of is next generation foresight practitioners. Actually, Mansi and I are both part of that community. It's an award program, but really you become part of a sensing network of young emerging futurist designers and change makers from around the world. And that also is a really great community to sort of start playing around with a lot of these things and exploring synergies.
Thank you. Really quick, we had this thing in the chat. What was the first project you said? What was it called? Or could you put the Instagram in the chat maybe?
I will, yeah, I'll put the handle in the chat.
Oh, okay, okay, gotcha, perfect. Thank you so much. All right, Mansi, a quick couple of words and then let's swing over to the audience questions.
Sure. So for me, actually, the community journey in the future space, that's the first place I actually learned about futures, was the original speculative futures meetup in San Francisco. Back in 2015, I think I was there at the second or third session. It really intrigued me. And then I moved back to India after being abroad for about roughly 2.5, 3 years. And I realized that, there weren't too many people doing this here, or at least that's what I thought initially. But as I began speaking to people, I realized that more and more people are interested. So that's one thing you can definitely do, is start talking about it. Talk to your friends about it. Find other people who are working on things that you think are interesting or fall in this space, and reach out to them as well. And that's what I did. And Future Tense actually started as a community. It started as a series of meetups, roundtable discussions, speaker sessions, workshops, etc. And honestly, feel free to reach out to me. And it's been a bit dormant in the last year because of the pandemic, but if enough people are interested, I'm more than happy to discuss sort of helping you build your own local communities or starting something online. And working with you to actually bring in people to talk about this. But the idea really is, is start talking about it, like build your own community. It doesn't have to be 500 people, it can be 5 people. But the moment you start exploring this a little bit more, you'll find that there are more people interested, and they'll begin to join you, they'll reach out to you. And honestly, like a lot of people that I have met in the future space through my journey in the past 4 or 5 years has basically been just me reaching out to people, or people seeing a tweet that I put out from the Future Tense account and reaching out to me and saying, hey, this is interesting, let's talk. And genuinely, that's the fastest way to talk about these things, to start these conversations. And teach yourself, constantly be looking out for new information. I've realized that the futures community is a very open space, in that people are willing to share their work, they're willing to share their thoughts with you, they're willing to work with you and build on something new. For example, we started Variations on Tomorrow. It's a design fiction zine where we're just sort of imagining different future possibilities. And the idea really to start it was that we wanted to do it because we wanted to put out more possibilities of the future than just the singular ones. But the idea has sort of morphed into saying that, okay, it could eventually be a platform for people who are putting out these plural interpretations of the future, and we can kind of amplify that because we have something of a network in the space as well. So feel free to reach out if you're in India and you're figuring out how to begin these conversations, and I'm more than happy to chat with you about it.
Thank you. And I'll just quickly plug go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to point people to the chat, because I shared another interesting community called Plurality University, to which I belong. And I encourage everyone to, one very easy way to contribute and to get engaged is with this project called Usign. It's kind of like a fanzine that every month it's kind of like collaboratively produced around different topics. So there's a couple of interesting topics coming in the next couple of months, like for example, identity. So that's another interesting way to get engaged with a community that is involved in, like cultivating plural images of the future.
Yep, absolutely. And I also just, my last part is I've also put in the chat, you're welcome to take a look at our speculative futures meetups. As I said, we have about over 50. The really cool thing, the silver lining of everybody being virtual right now is that most of the meetups are actually virtual. And so there's actually a couple of really good ones coming up in the next week or so. I should be better at remembering off the top of my head, but there's at least 2 or 3 coming up next week. They're really good. I think one's on the future of intimacy. There was something on the future of feminism coming up. So absolutely check our website. There's a calendar on there. And you can also start a chapter if you want. It's a pretty easy process. Just requires bringing together people who are interested in learning about this stuff and then bringing in resources and speakers. I also am the organizer for the New York City chapter, and among the many things I do with DFI. So it is a really fun and rewarding experience. I'm happy to chat with anyone about what it would be like to be a meetup leader and to do that work.